Professor Dongyuk decided to treat his disgusting students to drinks at a bar after the successful completion of their project. He praised them for their hard work, telling them that they had all done an excellent job. His students looked genuinely delighted to receive his appreciation and thanked him enthusiastically for the celebration. After spending some time with them, Professor Dongyuk glanced toward the teaching assistant, who was standing nearby, and informed her that he would be leaving. He explained that he did not want to get in the way while the younger students continued enjoying themselves, and admitted that he was already feeling tired. She understood and agreed without any objection. Before leaving, he handed his bank card to her, asking her to settle the bill on his behalf later. He also reminded the students not to drink too much before quietly making his way out of the bar. Once outside, he got into his car and started driving home. While driving, he began speaking softly to the woman sitting silently in the passenger seat beside him. He apologized for returning home so late, explaining that his students had refused to let him leave because they had been overly excited about successfully completing their first major project. He gently asked whether she had become hungry while waiting for him, and suggested that they should have a drink together once they arrived home. Since she remained completely silent, he wondered whether she was upset with him. However, the woman sitting beside him was not real. She was merely an illusion that appeared only on his birthday every year. She never spoke a single word and simply stared ahead with an emotionless expression. Deep down, he knew that she was nothing more than a creation of his own imagination, yet her presence felt painfully real to him. As he continued driving, his thoughts drifted back to the past. He reflected that the woman beside him was his beloved wife, Soyoung, the person he had loved more than anyone else in the world. During his graduate school years, he had met her on campus at the beginning of spring, after an unexpected incident had brought them together. She had entered his life like the warmth of the spring season itself, and he had fallen in love with her at first sight. Soyoung had already been a single mother when they first met, but that fact had never mattered to him. He had pursued her with unwavering determination, never giving up despite the difficulties. As time passed, she eventually accepted his sincere feelings, and the two of them fell deeply in love. They shared many happy years together before fate cruelly separated them when she passed away 7 years earlier. His thoughts returned to the present as he continued looking at the silent illusion beside him. He quietly begged her to say something, anything at all. Lately, he had felt as though he had been living alongside a lifeless version of his wife. At first, he had simply been grateful that he could still see her, even if only as an illusion. However, the inability to touch her, hear her voice, or have a conversation with her had gradually driven him closer to despair. He wished that she would smile at him just once, or speak a single sentence. In that moment, he felt that he would have willingly sacrificed almost anything just to hear her voice again. Eventually, he arrived home and stepped inside the house. His eyes immediately fell upon a family photograph displaying himself, Soyoung, and Jisoo together. Looking at the picture, he remembered how easily Soyoung had smiled during those happier days. He could not understand why the version of her that appeared before him now always wore such an expressionless face. He even wondered whether she was somehow angry with him. Later that night, he lay down on his bed, and once again the imaginary figure of Soyoung appeared beside him. Looking at her with deep longing, he confessed that he had never once looked at another woman since the day she had passed away. All he had ever wanted was to remain by her side forever. Before he could say anything else, the illusion suddenly vanished without warning. Her disappearance filled him with frustration and sadness, leaving him unable to understand why she always appeared only to disappear moments later. Unable to calm his emotions, he admitted to himself that he would never be able to fall asleep in such a state. He concluded that drinking some alcohol was probably the only way he could settle his restless mind. He walked out of his bedroom and opened the refrigerator, hoping that there might still be some leftover alcohol inside. At that moment, he suddenly realized why thoughts of Soyoung had become so overwhelming that day. It was his birthday, the only day each year when her silent image always appeared before him. Just then, another voice interrupted his thoughts as Jisoo appeared and greeted him, asking whether he had just returned home. Professor Dongyuk immediately wondered whether he had accidentally woken her. She assured him that he had not. He explained that he had been unable to fall asleep and had come looking for something to drink. Noticing the birthday cake she had prepared for him, he thanked her. Jisoo smiled warmly and mentioned that there was not much else to eat besides the cake, but she would prepare some snacks for him. She asked him to sit down while she headed into the kitchen and began making food. Watching her from a distance caused another wave of memories to surface. He reflected that ever since Soyoung's passing, he had been raising Jisoo by himself. Every year on his birthday, thoughts of Soyoung inevitably returned. Although he had always tried his best to care for Jisoo, he knew that she had probably needed her mother's love much more than anything he could provide. Even so, she had grown into a kind and thoughtful young woman despite his imperfect parenting. Realizing that his efforts had not been wasted filled him with quiet relief because she had become someone incredibly precious to him. As he looked at her, he could not help noticing just how much she resembled Soyoung. Her face, her height, and even the way she looked from behind reminded him almost perfectly of his late wife when she had been younger. She had grown into a beautiful woman, just like her mother. He quietly wondered whether that remarkable resemblance was the reason he found himself thinking about Soyoung more and more often. A short while later, Jisoo returned with the snacks and placed them in front of him. He asked whether she would like to have a drink with him. She politely declined at first, explaining that she was not very good at drinking alcohol. Professor Dongyuk smiled faintly and admitted that he and Soyoung had always shared drinks together, which naturally made him think of her again. Hearing that, Jisoo agreed to drink just a little with him. The two of them sat together, sharing drinks as they celebrated his birthday. After seeing how little alcohol Jisoo could handle, Professor Dongyuk playfully teased her, remarking that she was already a college student, yet still had such a low tolerance for alcohol. Jisoo laughed and replied that students nowadays did not drink nearly as heavily as people of his generation had done at the same age. Looking at her proudly, he commented that someone with her appearance was probably very popular at college. He wondered aloud whether many boys invited her out for drinks. Instead of answering directly, Jisoo grew serious. She confessed that she had always felt guilty because of the many sacrifices he had made while raising her. She promised that one day she would repay all of his kindness. She admitted that she had never expressed these feelings before, but sincerely thanked him for taking care of her all those years. Jisoo then gently told him that she knew he had never allowed himself to develop feelings for another woman because he had been worried about her. She reassured him that he no longer needed to carry that burden because she was fully grown now. More than anything else, she wanted him to find happiness again and live for himself. Professor Dongyuk quietly replied that there were still so many things he wanted to do for her as her parent. In response, Jisoo smiled warmly and told him that all she truly needed was him. Finally, she wished him a heartfelt happy birthday. By looking at Jisoo, Dongyuk suddenly found himself frozen in place as a familiar feeling washed over him. The longer he stared at her, the more he became convinced that, for some reason, she looked exactly like Soyoung. Her face, her expression, and the way she was looking at him made him question his own senses. While he was still struggling to understand what he was seeing, Jisoo gently looked at him and reminded him that it was his birthday. She softly remarked that they had already spent enough time drinking and suggested that they should stop and head to the bedroom instead. Without saying much else, the two of them eventually made their way into the room together. As Dongyuk looked at the person standing before him, he could hardly believe his own eyes. For a brief moment, it no longer seemed as though Jisoo was standing there. Instead, it felt as if Soyoung herself had appeared right in front of him. The illusion felt so vivid that he remained completely speechless, unable to separate reality from what his mind was showing him. However, only a moment later, he finally came back to his senses and realized that the person sitting in front of him was not Soyoung at all. It was Jisoo. Noticing how exhausted he looked, Jisoo quietly observed that he seemed extremely tired and gently suggested that they should call it a night instead of staying awake any longer. Hearing her words brought him back to reality even more. Deep inside, he reflected that, for just a single moment, Jisoo had looked exactly like his wife. The thought unsettled him so much that he began wondering whether he was slowly losing his mind. Trying to brush those thoughts aside, he simply agreed that ending the night would probably be the best idea. Even after agreeing, however, he found himself unable to stop looking at her. He repeatedly told himself that he should not be staring at Jisoo like that. Yet no matter how hard he tried, the image of Soyoung refused to leave his mind. His thoughts remained completely occupied by her, making it impossible for him to think clearly. Without even realizing what he was saying, he suddenly suggested that they should start a flexibility training together. The words came out almost automatically, as though he had spoken without thinking. Jisoo immediately reminded him that she was Jisoo, not the person he seemed to be imagining. Her voice finally pulled him back to reality once again. Feeling embarrassed by his behavior, he apologized and admitted that he was not thinking straight at that moment. Rather than becoming upset, Jisoo calmly replied that everything was all right and assured him that she could handle the situation. After that brief exchange, the awkward atmosphere gradually settled, and the two of them eventually began performing a private PT session together. The following morning, Dongyuk slowly opened his eyes after waking up. His mind remained clouded with everything that had happened the previous night, making it difficult for him to separate reality from imagination. For a brief moment, he convinced himself that everything must have been nothing more than a strange dream. He desperately wanted to believe that none of it had actually happened. However, as his thoughts became clearer, he gradually realized that it had not been a dream at all. Everything that had happened the previous night had been completely real. The realization immediately filled him with embarrassment, and he could not help thinking that he would never be able to face Jisoo properly again after everything that had happened. Before he could continue dwelling on those thoughts, Jisoo appeared in front of him as though nothing unusual had taken place. Looking at him with her usual calm expression, she reminded him that he was getting late and told him that he should hurry, eat breakfast, and get ready for work. Still completely confused, he quietly agreed, although his mind remained far from settled. Jisoo then informed him that breakfast would be ready shortly and asked him to wash up while she finished preparing everything. Before leaving for the bathroom, he hesitated for a moment before asking whether she had slept well the previous night. Without showing even the slightest sign of discomfort, Jisoo happily admitted that she had slept better than ever before. She even added that it was all thanks to him. Hearing those words surprised him even more than before. He was left completely speechless, unable to understand how she could behave so naturally after everything that had happened. Meanwhile, he quietly reflected that their mornings together had always been peaceful, just like every other day. Perhaps nothing had actually changed for her at all. Maybe he was the only one who had continued taking everything that had happened so seriously. While he remained lost in those thoughts, Jisoo calmly walked into the kitchen and continued preparing breakfast as though it were just another ordinary morning. After finishing his shower and getting himself ready, Dongyuk returned to the dining area where Jisoo had already prepared the meal. She warmly invited him to sit down and eat with her. However, he quietly declined, telling her that he was fine and that he simply did not feel like eating anything. Even as he said those words, he continued reminding himself that he should never allow such inappropriate thoughts to enter his mind ever again. Despite his refusal, Jisoo gently insisted that he should at least eat a little before leaving for work. Unable to refuse her any longer, he eventually took a seat at the table. Even then, as he stared at the food placed in front of him, his thoughts remained completely elsewhere. He could barely comprehend the meal sitting before him because his mind was far too distracted. Before he even realized it himself, all of his attention had once again drifted toward Jisoo and her appearance. He silently scolded himself over and over again, convincing himself that he should not be responding to her in such a way. He knew those thoughts were wrong, yet he found himself completely unable to stop thinking about her like that. Seeing that he was barely touching the food, Jisoo gently asked whether he liked the breakfast she had prepared. Instead of answering her question properly, Dongyuk hurriedly stood up and explained that he really needed to leave now and would not be able to finish the meal. Jisoo simply accepted his response without questioning him any further, and quietly replied that it was all right. Shortly afterward, Dongyuk finished getting ready and headed toward the door. Without saying anything else, he left the house while Jisoo remained standing there in silence, watching him leave with a blank expression that revealed nothing about what she was thinking. After that, Dongyuk made his way to the university as usual. As soon as he arrived on campus, several students greeted him respectfully while passing by, and he acknowledged each of them before continuing toward his department. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until another professor suddenly approached him. Slightly surprised by the unexpected visit, Dongyuk asked what had brought him there and whether there was any particular reason he wanted to meet him. The professor explained that he had actually come to meet the head of Dongyuk's department, so he had decided to stop by while he was there. He also mentioned that his wife had been asking about Dongyuk and wanted to know how he had been doing lately. After a brief pause, the professor brought up another matter and explained that his company had recently taken on a major architectural project. Because of its scale, he had been wondering if Dongyuk would be willing to help them with it. He admitted that he had always wanted to try incorporating Dongyuk's style of architecture into one of their projects, but no one seemed to understand that particular approach the way Dongyuk did. Since he had several important plans for the day, he suggested that they leave the detailed discussion for another time and simply asked Dongyuk to think about the offer until then. Just as the conversation was coming to an end, the professor called out to his wife, who had been waiting inside the car. A moment later, she stepped out and warmly greeted Dongyuk. Her name was Sujeong. Smiling, her husband explained that they were actually planning to have a date night around the university campus that day, just like they used to during their younger days. Looking at Sujeong, Dongyuk jokingly wondered whether he should start addressing her as madam now. Hearing that, Sujeong immediately laughed and told him not to make her sound so old, insisting that he should simply continue calling her by her name as he always had. Dongyuk hesitated and remarked that it felt a little strange to call her so casually while standing in front of her husband, who was his senior professor. He encouraged Dongyuk to behave naturally, just as he had back when they were all still at the university together. Jokingly, he added that perhaps it was because Sujeong was living with an old man like himself that she always wanted to appear younger than she really was. Bringing the conversation to an end, he said that they should be on their way now and reminded Dongyuk to think carefully about the offer before getting back to him. Hearing that, Sujeong curiously asked what kind of offer he had made. Her husband merely smiled and teasingly replied that it was something she did not need to know. After sharing one last smile, the couple got back into the car and left together. As they drove away, the professor asked Sujeong whether she wanted to go somewhere else afterward. She quietly admitted that she was not sure where she wanted to go because it had been such a long time since they had gone out together. After thinking for a moment, she suggested that they visit the place where they had first met each other. Watching them leave, Dongyuk quietly reflected that Sujeong had once been his junior back in college and was now married to the professor he had always respected and looked up to. She had always been someone who shined as brightly as her own name suggested, carrying herself with a naturally cheerful and charming personality. Yet now, As he looked at her, he could not help feeling that there was a sadness hidden behind her smile. She no longer seemed quite like the lively person he remembered, and the difference did not escape his notice. Later that evening, Dong-yuk finally returned home after finishing his work at the university. As he walked toward the house, he quietly reflected that he had intentionally come home around the time when Jisoo usually went to bed. Ever since the previous night, it had become increasingly difficult for him to face her directly. Even though he kept telling himself that nothing had actually happened and that he was simply overthinking everything, the awkwardness still refused to disappear. Taking a deep breath, he finally stepped inside the house. The moment he entered, he found Jisoo sitting on the floor, busy cleaning the room. As soon as she noticed him, she greeted him naturally and welcomed him home. She casually explained that she was finishing the cleaning because she had not been able to complete it before leaving the house that morning. Dong-yuk simply acknowledged what she said with a quiet response. Deep inside, however, he felt a small sense of relief. Their conversation sounded much more natural than it had that morning, and the uncomfortable atmosphere between them did not feel nearly as awkward as before. Even so, he continued reminding himself that he should avoid looking at her too much. While he was trying to keep his composure, Jisoo suddenly called his name. She handed him a towel and asked him to soak it for her. Caught off guard by the request, Dong-yuk quietly accepted the towel. Feeling that he had no real reason to refuse, he eventually agreed to help her with what she had asked. Dong-yuk asked Jisoo whether she needed any more help with the cleaning. The moment those words left his mouth, he immediately felt awkward and questioned himself, wondering why even such a simple sentence sounded so unnatural to him now. Taking the towel she had handed him, he quietly walked into the bathroom to rinse it. As he stood there washing it, his thoughts once again drifted back to everything that had happened the previous night. No matter how desperately he tried to push those memories away, they continued to linger in his mind. He silently reflected that he simply could not forget what had happened between them. He even began blaming himself, thinking that his thoughts were so inappropriate that he would not be surprised if someone thought he deserved to be punished for them. He could not understand why, even now, he continued having those thoughts every time he looked at Jisoo. After finishing, he returned from the bathroom and handed the towel back to her. He quietly asked whether there was anything else she needed him to do. Jisoo calmly replied that she had already finished most of the work. She explained that she only needed him to hand over the rag he had just washed because, after scrubbing the floor, the water had become extremely dirty from all the dust, and she needed the clean rag to finish everything properly. Listening to her explanation, Dong-yuk silently handed it over, but once again he found himself unable to calm his mind. Every single time he looked at her, memories from the previous night flashed through his head without warning, making him even more uncomfortable than before. Trying to escape those thoughts, he told her that he was going to his room to change his clothes. Deep inside, he kept telling himself that he should stay as far away from her as possible. However, he quickly realized that avoiding her was almost impossible in such a small apartment where they constantly crossed paths throughout the day. As he was about to leave, he noticed Jisoo struggling to place some luggage on the upper shelf of the cupboard. Without thinking much about it, he instinctively walked over and helped her lift the luggage into place. While helping her, he quietly reflected that no matter how hard he tried to avoid getting involved with her, it never seemed to work. Ever since the previous night, Jisoo had been speaking to him much more eagerly than before, making it even harder for him to distance himself from her. Not long afterward, she asked him to bring over any laundry that was still inside his room so that she could wash everything together. Situations like that continued happening one after another, leaving him with almost no opportunity to stay away from her. As he watched everything unfold, he could not help thinking that perhaps the cleaning itself had become surprisingly dangerous for him, because every small interaction with Jisoo only caused his thoughts to become even more complicated. Once everything had finally been finished, Jisoo thanked him for helping her. Dong-yuk immediately shook his head and replied that there was no reason for her to thank him, because she had done almost all of the work herself, while he had only helped with a few small things. Jisoo smiled softly before mentioning that moving everything around had made her sweat quite a bit and that she was going to take a shower. Before heading toward the bathroom, she politely asked whether he wanted to use it first. Dong-yuk simply declined and told her that she could go ahead instead. With that, Jisoo walked into the bathroom to take her shower while Dong-yuk quietly sat down on the couch by himself. Sitting there alone, he let out a small sigh of relief. He reflected that everything had gone much better than he had expected because he had managed to control himself throughout the entire evening. Although his thoughts had wandered countless times, he had not allowed them to affect his actions. After everything had finally settled down, he made his way to his room and lay down on his bed. As exhaustion gradually overtook him, he quietly reflected that it had been an incredibly difficult day. Now that he no longer felt as tense as before, sleep was finally beginning to overtake him. He also realized that, unlike the previous day, he had not been seeing visions of Soyoung anymore. He believed that it was because his attention had been completely distracted by Jisoo instead. Even so, that realization did not bring him much comfort. Instead, He admitted to himself that he had been feeling strangely hollow and unbearably lonely lately. Just as he was about to close his eyes and fall asleep, Jisoo suddenly entered his room. Startled by her unexpected appearance, Dong-yuk immediately asked why she had come there. Looking slightly uneasy, Jisoo quietly explained that she had been having frightening dreams every night recently and that she was afraid of sleeping alone. Before Dong-yuk could even process what she had said, she calmly climbed onto the bed beside him and simply stated that she wanted to sleep there. Her unexpected decision left him even more surprised than before, and he could only stare at her in complete disbelief. Jisoo quietly remarked that Dong-yuk had also been looking unusually restless these days. She gently told him that she wanted to stay with him that night because he had been working far too much lately and was barely taking proper care of himself. She pointed out that he was always busy with work and was not even eating his meals properly, making her worried about his health. Hearing her concern, Dong-yuk responded with a faint smile, saying that he was not so old that his daughter needed to worry about his health like that. Jisoo listened to his response before softly telling him that they would always live together. Dong-yuk simply nodded and agreed with her. After a brief moment of silence, Jisoo admitted that she did not want to be alone in her life. Her words caused Dong-yuk to reflect quietly, believing that although she felt that way now, she would eventually find a husband in the future. He gently told her that someday she would have a partner of her own and would not have to remain alone forever. Upon hearing those words, Jisoo looked at him warmly and replied that he always made her feel so happy. Not long after saying that, she gradually drifted off to sleep. Later, in the middle of the night, Jisoo found herself unable to sleep as she quietly reflected on everything that had happened the previous night. She thought that the incident had been an incredibly shocking experience for her, one that she had never expected to go through. She still could not believe that Dong-yuk had missed his wife so deeply that he had mistaken her for his wife. Even while thinking about it, however, she admitted to herself that it had not been an unpleasant experience. Deep inside, she realized that she had also wanted to perform the core training together with him. Although he did not agree immediately, her persistence and consistency eventually convinced him, and he finally agreed to her request. After that, the two of them decided to perform the core training together. They mutually agreed that what they were doing would remain a small secret shared only between the two of them. As they continued spending time together through those training sessions, they gradually became wonderful partners who worked well alongside each other. A few days later, Dong-yuk was sitting alone in his university office while finishing the last of his work for the day. As he wrapped everything up, he quietly reflected on how different he had been feeling lately. His body felt much lighter than before, and even his complexion seemed noticeably healthier. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it was all thanks to Jisoo. She handled all of the household chores without complaint, prepared meals just as her mother used to, and even helped him maintain his competitive 1v1 fight. Thinking about everything she had been doing for him, he felt deeply grateful and believed that he owed all of those positive changes to her. He wondered if the reason he felt so different was because he had finally regained the energy that he thought he had lost. Before he even realized it himself, he found that he had started craving more stretching session with her. As Dong-yuk remained seated in his office, the door suddenly opened, and Soo-jeong walked inside before greeting him. Looking up, Dong-yuk commented that he had been seeing her around the campus quite frequently lately. Soo-jeong casually replied that it was not as though she was someone he was forbidden from seeing. She then asked whether he had already finished all of his work for the day. Dong-yuk answered that he had just completed everything he needed to do. After replying, he asked whether she had come there by herself before immediately asking about the professor. Hearing that, Soo-jeong pointed out that it had already been ages since he had been her professor, yet he still seemed unable to stop thinking about him. Dong-yuk explained that it was not like that at all, and clarified that he had only been worried that something might have happened to the professor. Soo-jeong then admitted the real reason for her visit, telling him that she had actually come because she wanted to see him. After taking a seat, she reminded him that although he clearly did not remember, that day was the one they had planned to discuss their project over dinner. Dong-hyuk immediately admitted that he had completely forgotten because life had been extremely hectic for him lately, and so many things had been occupying his mind. Soo-jeong then suggested that they should leave together right away, explaining that she would take him to the restaurant so they could discuss the project over dinner as they had originally planned. After hearing her suggestion, Dong-hyuk agreed, and the two of them prepared to leave together. Dong-hyuk was sitting quietly in the car beside Soo-jeong when she casually mentioned that they were heading to her house instead of anywhere else. Her unexpected announcement immediately caught him off guard, and he turned toward her with a surprised expression. Seeing his reaction, she calmly explained that she had already told her husband that they should all meet at their home because she had wanted the chance to cook a meal for him himself after such a long time. Hearing that only made him even more surprised. After thinking about it for a moment, he remarked that, now that he thought about it, it had been a very long time since they had spent any time together after she got married. He then shifted the conversation toward her married life and commented that, from what he had always believed, the professor seemed to treat her very well. Soo-jeong smiled faintly before admitting that, Lately, she honestly did not know if he had been treating her as well as he used to. Her response lingered in Dong-yuk's mind, but before he could continue asking about it, they had already reached her house. As they stepped out of the car, the professor was already standing outside waiting to welcome them. Looking at Dong-yuk with a warm smile, he commented that it was probably the first time Dong-yuk had ever visited their home. Dong-yuk nodded in agreement and confirmed that it was indeed his first visit since they had built the house and moved into it. The moment he walked inside, his attention was immediately drawn to the architecture. Looking around carefully, he admired the high ceiling, noting how it would provide much better ventilation throughout the house. He also complimented the thoughtful placement of the windows and doors, pointing out how naturally everything had been designed. As he continued looking around, he praised one architectural detail after another, expressing genuine admiration for the overall structure and layout of the house. Sujeong smiled as she watched the two men and invited them to sit down and continue talking while she finished preparing everything. Even after taking his seat, Dong-yuk continued complimenting the architecture, mentioning how beautifully every part of the house had been planned. Hearing those compliments, the professor smiled proudly and remarked that he had known Dong-yuk would be the one person who would truly recognize the value of those architectural details, instead of simply looking at the appearance of the house. Dong-yuk responded by saying that the house was incredibly beautiful, elegant, and pleasant, adding with a smile that he was actually jealous of the lady who had the privilege of living in such a wonderful home. The professor laughed before telling him that instead of admiring the house any longer, he should come and enjoy the food that the lady of the house had prepared for them. As they approached the dining table, a large variety of dishes had already been arranged into an impressive spread. Looking at the table with satisfaction, the professor proudly commented that Sujeong had worked extremely hard to prepare such a wonderful meal for them. Sujeong immediately laughed at his words and modestly admitted that most of the food had actually been delivered, so it had not been nearly as difficult as he was making it sound. She then warmly invited both of them to sit down and begin eating, mentioning that she was going upstairs to change her clothes before joining them again. After she left the dining room, the professor began pouring drinks for Dong-yuk, and the two of them continued talking while enjoying both the meal and several glasses of wine together. As time passed and they drank more and more, the atmosphere became much more relaxed. Eventually, after having quite a lot to drink, the professor asked Dong-yuk whether he had finally decided if he was going to join their company. By then, Sujeong had returned and taken her seat at the table. Looking at her husband, she pointed out that he had practically finished all of the wine himself and lightly scolded him by saying that he should have waited until another time before bringing up such an important discussion. Dong-yuk politely responded that he would carefully think about the offer letter before making any decision. The professor immediately replied that he truly could not do it without Dong-yuk and sincerely hoped he would accept the offer. Watching her husband continue drinking, Sujeong quietly remarked that he had been drinking far too much lately. Dong-yuk looked at the professor respectfully and reassured her that everything was perfectly fine, saying that the professor was healthy enough to take care of himself without worrying too much. Sujeong simply nodded in agreement, although she still seemed slightly concerned. Before long, the professor had drunk so much that he completely passed out. Without wasting any time, Dong-yuk stood up to help him. As he supported the professor's weight, Sujeong informed him that the bedroom was located on the second floor because her husband had ended up falling asleep on the couch downstairs. Together, they made sure he was settled comfortably before returning downstairs. After everything had quieted down, Dong-yuk and Sujeong once again sat across from each other at the dining table, with the atmosphere becoming much calmer than before. Holding her drink, Sujeong softly remarked that it had been such a long time since the two of them had shared a drink together like this. Dong-yuk smiled as he agreed, reminiscing that they had often drunk together during their student days and that they had made countless enjoyable memories during that period of their lives. Listening to him, Sujeong smiled nostalgically and admitted that she had spent those days simply following him around wherever he went. She then sighed lightly and confessed that she had never imagined she would become an old married woman so quickly. Dong-yuk gently shook his head and told her that she was still very beautiful. Looking directly at him, she asked if he still thought she was charming even now. Without any hesitation, he answered that, of course he did. He explained that, although she had been a cheerful, energetic, and bubbly person during their younger days, she now carried herself with a graceful sense of maturity and femininity that suited her very well. His sincere compliment made her quietly look at him for a brief moment before she suddenly changed the topic. She told him that, if he was already comfortable enough around her, she wanted to perform a stretching session with him. Her unexpected suggestion completely caught Dong-yuk by surprise, and he looked at her with visible confusion. Calmly noticing his reaction, she explained that she honestly did not think it was such a big deal and believed there was nothing wrong with the two of them doing it together. Even though he remained hesitant because of how unexpected the request was, she continued insisting without changing her mind. After listening to her repeatedly, Dong-yuk eventually gave in and agreed to perform the stretching session with her. After completing the stretching session together, Dongyuk and Suzhong returned to the living room, and he quietly remarked that the professor had not woken up yet and said that it was probably time for him to leave.